Lucien,
Hey, how's it?
welcome to our seminar. Uh, I will start the online transmission for you from my iPad, but you can start the people here and our attendants are lesson. Okay, and I'm ready to start. You can start. So
Okay.
let's do it.
All right. I just wanted to check with the translator whether I must pause now and then or just go.
Yes, let me check. Tá funcionando a tradução? Yes. Okay. You start. You can start now.
Okay. And must I say a few things then pause, or what speed must I go?
Sorry.
Must I say a few things then pause, or will he translate simultaneously?
No, they are translating simultaneously.
Oh, okay.
So you can use talking and the people will receive
I'll
the
talk in a
translation.
normal. Then
Don't
I'll
worry.
talk in a normal way. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to give a talk here. I will be talking about anarchism in the periphery, thinking about the history of anarchism in the colonial and the post-colonial world. That is to say, I want to think about the history of anarchism as a global movement, but to pay particular attention to the history of anarchism in what we would call the third world or the tricontinent. The first thing, though, before we can talk about anarchism in any particular part of the world, is to have a definition of what we mean by anarchism. We need to have a definition of the topic, and it is more complex than it might seem to have such a definition. Some people would say you can't define anarchism by its very nature. The problem with that argument is that that already assumes a definition, which is to say you cannot make a definition logically that is based on not having a definition of a topic. You're already making definitive characters. And it really doesn't help us in a very practical level if we say anarchism can't be defined. Well, it doesn't really take us anywhere scientifically. Another common approach on defining anarchism is to define anarchism in terms of a movement that is against the state. Now, anarchism is such a movement, but simply to define a movement as against the state is completely inadequate to define anarchism. If we define any movement that is against the state as anarchist, there's no reason why orthodox Marxism cannot be included in the anarchist category. Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, many other orthodox Marxists believe the state would and should wither away. Now, there's no particular reason why not to include them. So, there's also no real rational basis for a definition of anarchism as simply a movement which is against the state. If we define anarchism as simply against the state, there has to be a reason for such a model, and there isn't really. It's just an assertion. It is not really based on a rational methodology. A larger problem with this is that if we define anarchism as simply something which is against the state, is we lose a lot of its content. Anarchism, I think, could reasonably be argued to be against capitalism, could reasonably be argued to be against hierarchy. But of course, you could be against the state and be for authority. You could be against the state, you could be for hierarchy. So there again, this doesn't help us. A further point is if we define anarchism just in terms of anti-statism, it's very hard to explain why such a movement would come about. It's difficult to explain it historically as a current in thought, as a social movement that existed. Now, there's a few other problems I want to bring around the issue of the definition, and then we will start to construct a proper, adequate definition, and from that I will be able to move to the issue of the periphery and the global working class. Now, if we want to define the history of anarchism, we have to be very careful not to include things which are irrelevant. So there has to be a criterion for judgment about what becomes included. Otherwise, it simply becomes a grab bag of everybody who once said something that we might like or not like. You can find many anarchist studies in English, which are essentially a long list of anybody who ever said something vaguely against the state. A book by Peter Marshall includes Che Guevara in the anarchists. It includes Margaret Thatcher. I don't think this is reasonable. Inclusion also becomes quite arbitrary. Usually these books will not include libertarian Marxists like Anton Pannekoek. It will not include people like Otto Ruhl, so it doesn't really make sense. So, to bring this together, to define anarchism vaguely as saying it has no definition, to define anarchism as saying it's anything that's against the state, to define anarchism as some sort of timeless spirit of revolt, none of these things really take us anywhere. They don't really explain what should be in the category, what should be outside the category. And if we can't define what is in, what is out, it becomes impossible to do any sort of historical or theoretical study of the subject. It's simply a non-starter. If we don't know what's in, what do we study? If we don't know which ideas fit, how do we analyze them? Now, the solution to this problem is to actually look historically. The fact of the matter is, and there's absolutely no dispute about this, the emergence of an anarchist movement, as a movement defined as anarchist, as a movement identified by its contemporaries as anarchist, that dates to the 1860s. Such a movement emerges very specifically in the International Working Men's Association. That is to say, it emerges in what we call the First International. Before that time, the idea that there is a thing such as anarchism which should be studied, the idea that there's a movement called anarchism which must define itself simply doesn't exist. It is with the emergence of this movement historically in the 1860s, in the First International, around Mikhail Bakunin, around Peter Kropotkin, Erika Malatesta, these sort of figures, that anarchism becomes a subject of study, that anarchism becomes a movement that starts to make its own claims. Among those claims, by the way, are some very dubious historical claims. It's not to say that that movement produces the most scientific histories of itself. It has an ideological approach. Now, if anarchism emerges in the 1860s, and it emerges in the First International, very concretely, we're talking about anarchism emerging in a clash as part of a set of debates with other socialist and working class currents. We're talking about a movement which emerged in a debate with orthodox Marxism, with the Blanquism of Louis Blanqui. We are talking about a movement that debated people like the followers of Proudhon. This means, in other words, that anarchism has to be understood as a movement that is rooted in socialism. It is a current within socialism. It is rooted in working class, organized working class movements. And it is a movement that emerges as a result of the major changes of the transition to the modern world. In other words, the intellectual and the social foundations of anarchism are to be found in the modern period, and specifically in a response by a section of working classes, organized working classes, to those changes. So its intellectual roots have to be located within the claims of enlightenment, that is, of progress, of science, of reason, of human mastery of the future, and its social base has to be located with the new class forces that emerged at the time, the industrial working class, the trade union movement, the idea of a socialism that does not make reference to the Bible or Quran, but one which makes reference to claims of science and justice, and the Enlightenment claims of science on the one hand and of human rights on the other. So, what were the ideas of this new movement that emerged? This new anarchist movement that emerged was fundamentally a movement which was opposed to hierarchy. It was a movement which was opposed to domination of people over people. Fundamentally, at the baseline, a distinguishing feature of the anarchist movement is a rejection of relations of hierarchy between people. Now, when it started to unpack this, it also meant, from this basis of opposition to hierarchy, that anarchism opposed capitalism. So its critique of capitalism was not just a critique that capitalism exploited, or even a critique that capitalism impoverished, or even a critique that capitalism alienated labor. It was a critique fundamentally that capitalism was a system in which the few ruled, exploited, dominated the many. So to remove exploitation without removing domination for the anarchists would be completely inadequate. Similarly, this translated into a critique of the state apparatus. The modern state, which was sometimes a nation state, was sometimes an imperial state, was sometimes a federal state. For the anarchists, all of these forms, sometimes republican, sometimes authoritarian, sometimes monarchical, all of those forms were problematic for the simple reason that just like capitalism concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a few, so do state apparatuses. So anarchism was against hierarchy. This led it to be against the capitalist system. This led it to be against the state. And it also led it to a politics from here of being anti-imperialist, a politics of being anti-colonial, a politics of being opposed to gender oppression, and a politics that stressed that social change has to come from below. So when we move from the critique in anarchism of the current form of modernity, we come to the strategic imperatives, and those come to, first and foremost, a struggle from below to reconstitute society. Secondly, a struggle from below that is self-managed, that anticipates the future society, which is to say, prefigurative politics. Further, a movement that would be based in the popular classes, by which I mean the working class, the peasantry, and the poor. Precisely because it linked issues of hierarchy to capitalism and the state, and it linked those issues to class. It was a classist movement. It was a movement that was arguing for the self-emancipation, not of society in general, not of humanity in general or man in general, but specifically an emancipation of humanity by the popular classes, by the working class, by the peasantry, by the poor, the unemployed, and so forth. This would be an international movement, since the movements, the class forces, the problems are international problems. So the idea was that these movements would have to be an international class struggle. And the final thing is it would need to reconstitute society into a society that was self-managed, a society that was free of social and economic inequality, a society free of exploitation and domination, based on cooperative production, self-management, some sort of participatory planning, and a universal human community. So to bring this together, the anarchists were socialists, but socialists of a certain type. All anarchists are socialists, but not all socialists are anarchists. Anarchists have elements which are similar to liberals in that they are for the freedom of the individual, but they reject capitalism. With the Marxists, they reject capitalism, but unlike the Marxists, they also reject the state apparatus, vanguardism, and various top-down. I'm thinking here specifically of orthodox Marxism. So we could say that the anarchists were striving for a modernity that kept its promise. They were striving for a modernity in which the claims for political rights and economic equality were made real. A society in which democracy was completely generalized into workplaces, into communities, into education, into the sphere of the family, society more generally, the territory, and so forth. Now, having defined anarchism in that way and dating it specifically to the First International, and having defined anarchism in that way, the question becomes, where do these principles come from? The principles of which I'm referring to are the principles of the movement that emerged in the First International. And we can find it in the works of Mikhail Bakunin, Peter Kropotkin, Errico Malatesta. So these were the principles extracted from an analysis of that historical moment. They're not arbitrarily constructed by me. They are simply a description of what this movement stood for. Now, this allows us to have a clear focus. What is anarchism? We now have a very clear focus on exactly what we're going to look at. We have a clear sense of the movement that emerged and its ideas and its approach to the world. We secondly have an idea of the organizational womb of this movement. And fundamentally, it's a movement emerging in the First International, a movement in which the break between Bakunin and Marx in 1872 is decisive. It's not the start, but it's a decisive in the evolution. Now, with this, we should also bear in mind that the First International was an international organization. Although it was a movement which originated in West Europe, by the time of the split and in the years afterwards, it was a movement that had affiliates in Latin America, parts of North Africa, in parts of Asia, parts of the periphery of Europe, East Europe. So I would argue that this movement was not simply constituted at a meeting in Geneva Sanimir. It was a movement not just constituted a meeting in London or a meeting in at The Hague. It was a movement which was constituted above all internationally, simultaneously and transnationally. It was part of an international way of thinking, an international way of organizing by an emerging, rising international working class that was organizing internationally. Now, using this clear definition, we have to now start to think globally. We have to start losing this historical basis. We have to now start thinking globally. We have to start using a global framework to understand the history of anarchism. And what I'm really just going to argue in the second part of this is to say that using a global framework, I want to make the case first that anarchism was historically, in many contexts, a mass movement. It was not the poor cousin of social democracy or orthodox Marxism. In many cases, it was a far larger movement than orthodox Marxism. In many countries, many regions, it was a larger movement. It played such a key role in anti-imperialist, labor, peasant, and popular struggles that it is not possible to appreciate the history of anti-imperialist, labor, peasant, and popular struggles in many contexts without recognizing the role of the anarchists. So I'm arguing anarchism is a mass movement which left an imprint on a wide range of sectors of struggle. So I should make one last qualification here, which is there were different types of anarchism. But above all, the difference between the types of anarchism was a difference at the level of strategy. That is to say, it was a difference between what I would call an insurrectionist anarchism and a mass organizing anarchism. So the basic distinction in anarchism, which we can explore later, was not between philosophical anarchism, Christian anarchism, or communist anarchism. It was between mass or mass-based organizing anarchism and insurrectionist or propaganda by the deed anarchism. All right. When we start to look at anarchism globally, we face the immediate problem that the history of anarchism has not been understood globally, which is to say, historically, anarchism has been historically underrated as a social force, and a huge part of the reason for this is that general narratives of the history of anarchism are narratives that focus on the North Atlantic. Essentially, if you pick up any major work on anarchism, whether it's the work of Daniel Guérin, whether it's George Woodcock, whether it's James Joll, Peter Marshall, essentially that is a history of anarchism in parts of the North Atlantic, the United States, parts of West Europe, maybe a bit of Russia. It's a view of anarchism that is very parochial, that elides the history of most of the movement. It is a movement that does not really take into account as a central part of the history of anarchism the three quarters of humanity that comprise the colonial and the post-colonial world. And we can look at many cases. Peter Marshall's study of anarchism gave 2 out of 41 chapters, or 33 pages, to the entire Third World, or colonial and post-colonial world. So the problem with this sort of framing is when we start to look at anarchism as a movement and we start to read beyond these narratives, it becomes quite clear that most of the history of anarchism took place in the East and in the South, not in the North and in the West, which is to say most of the history of anarchism historically as a movement, as an intellectual current, took place in Latin America, took place in the Caribbean, parts of Africa, East Asia, South Asia, peripheral Europe. I'm talking about East Europe, the Balkans, the Baltic states, these areas. So when we start to look at this, I think we need to start getting a different position.